So welcome all to this thinking in partnership with BP about biodiversity, with the specific question: what more should all of us be doing to protect nature? And it's a huge topic, and one which we can address in lots of ways. I hope it will look particularly at the role of business. I suppose one of the things that we might touch upon is also the very different definition of biodiversity, which I, in my own layman's way, just define as the variety of life on Earth. But it was interesting. I noticed this very morning that the World Economic Forum issued a paper which said we can solve the climate crisis, but only if we recognise the urgency of tackling the nature crisis alongside it, which is about as stark a way of framing it as you can possibly get. I think it's generally acknowledged that we're now in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of the species. This iteration is man-made, and it's not just a matter of moral or aesthetic shame, but because ecosystems are so tightly geared and entangled, there is a clear and present danger to humanity and the planet if we don't do something about it. Just one particular, I'm going to abuse the role of host just by saying that as the months have passed, we've emphasised more and more at Tortoise that the importance of walking the walk rather than talking the talk, not least through the outcomes of the indexes that my fellow partner Alexandra Mzavizidie and her team of generating responsible government and AI. And I think it would be terrific if today we can kind of, as far as possible, as we're looking at this, huge planetary issue, focus on the practical, the doing. We are surrounded by a kind of spaghetti mound of frameworks, organisations. The UK post 2010 diversity framework, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. We were going to have the UN Biodiversity Forum, but it was postponed to later next year, May. And then, of course, COP26 coming up in November. So much to talk about. But I do hope we'll be able to zero in on the gritty and the granular, as well as the broad and the philosophical. In the usual spirit, I just want to start by saying a few details of housekeeping. By now, you are all Zombies and know, I'm sure, how to operate the system. Just in case you don't, do chip in at the chat box, where my colleague Ella Hill will be keeping order, and let us know what you're thinking, and if you want to chip in, or if you are more of a traditionalist, the participants key will enable you to get to the raise hand facility. If you click the raise hand button on the bottom right, that lets me know that you'd like to join in, and I very much hope you all will, because the point of a ThinkIn, as James said at the start, is very much to crowdsource people's ideas and contributions so that we can advance the debate. Now, we're very lucky in another respect that we have BP's cartoonist, Jenny Leonard, with us today. And I hope we will be able to go and see what she's up to as she draws during the course of the debate. There she's already, look, how amazing is that? So we'll be going to Jenny. Lovely to have you with us, and we'll be going to you from time to time to see how you're getting on. We have 3 fantastic experts with us today, really, really spoiled by their quality and range. And I want to go to them in turn, just to kick things off, and ask them some sort of framing questions about the subject we're addressing. Starting with Professor Dieter Helm from Oxford. Good morning, Dieter. Are you on mute? There you are. Very nice to see you. Dieter, you've been involved in this for a long while. You've written a great and distinguished length about it. You had a book out in September, I believe, called Net Zero, and you are, constantly thinking about the way in which to approach this and related subjects. And I suppose I wanted to ask you something about the manner of approach, which is that when I talk to people about this very subject, you sort of get a series of responses, which range from sometimes indifference, sometimes a kind of directionless enthusiasm, and then, most depressing of all, a kind of fatalism. And I'm intrigued to know what, at this particular point, in the middle of a pandemic, you think are the prospects for doing something about biodiversity, and what sort of coalitions can be formed to move progress along?
Well, that's a lot of questions all in one go.
Yeah.
But let me frame it too. So I think the fundamental difficulty is that people think that there's the economy and the bread and butter stuff and how to deal with the economic costs and debt and burden that's been caused by the lockdown, for example, and the environment, which is some kind of luxury. This is just a fundamental mistake. And that's what leads to the kind of pessimism which some people understandably have. You know, the mistake is to think that the economy lives on its own, separate from the environment, that we can kind of do without it, and it's a nice luxury if we can add it on. Actually, the right way to think about this is that the environment is the economy. It's a core part of everything we do in the economy. And maybe we'll have a chance to explore this later, but a central theme of the way I think about this is, you know, what would the environment be like if our economy was efficient? And the answer is that all the costs of all our activities will be incorporated properly into the economy, of which the abiding principle is the polluters, and ultimately that's you and me, would pay for any damage we cause. Imagine a world where the damage that's done through agriculture and a number of other activities to the environment faces a cost to those people doing the damage. Imagine if we had a proper price of carbon. Now, it wouldn't solve all of it. There are other dimensions that are needed, but that's radical, and that is an efficient economy. And another way of putting it is, you know, we are living beyond our environmental means. That means that what we have is unsustainable economic growth. And, you know, many people would accept, you know, it is unsustainable what we're doing, the debts, the pollution, the climate change, the biodiversity damage, but they never follow through with the consequence or the corollary, which is that if it's unsustainable, it will not be sustained. And that's what environmentalists keep telling us. And so we have to get back on a sustainable economic path. That is a better economy than one we have at the moment. And ultimately, it's the only economy which delivers the best economic outputs properly considered for everybody. So I'm optimistic that this can be solved or partly solved in an economic fashion, but not with the kind of economics that we have now, with a proper view of what a sustainable economy is and where the environment is right at the center of everything that is our economic activity. And where we pollute, we pay for the damage we cause.
And on the specifics of biodiversity, Dieter, what sanctions and incentives can be offered to businesses to encourage them to behave in a way that is, you know, helpful to the preservation of nature and its variety?
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about biodiversity, we can think about, you know, each individual species, and we often focus on that. But actually what we're really talking about is the ecosystems within which these species are embedded. Now, if you look at what damages the natural capitals of our environment, these ecosystems, okay, it's, you know, high pesticide nitrate farming. Well, if you paid for the carbon in the nitrates, if you paid for the pollution runoff, if you paid for the consequences of cleaning up our water, you would use different farming practices to what you're doing. And if you paid for the carbon, you know, one of the interesting things which I've learned in recent times through the Natural Capital Committee and from scientists is, you know, most of the biodiversity is beneath our feet. Soil has 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere. And if you start to put the carbon back into the soils, you do good things for biodiversity and for the climate at the same time. If you start to think about tree cover, if you think about, you know, how badly we use the land, well, faced with the right prices, farmers would start to do the right things rather than paying them perverse incentives to do the wrong things. Now, that's just agriculture. Of course, transport's part of this. Of course, our own personal consumption is part of this. But, you know, if you face the right prices, you know, your behavior would change. It's not enough to solve the problem, but it would be a hell of a lot different from what we have at the moment.
So would it be fair to characterize your approach as a system where, as it were, state or international authorities establish a pricing structure within which businesses are free to make decisions within that ordered marketplace? Is that a because often market versus state is the way in which these issues are framed. But I take it that what you're really describing is something a bit more subtle.
Yeah, I think it's not the state versus the market. I think that's a kind of stale canard that people trot out. Okay, so if we have pollution in our society, the traditional way to do it is to regulate it. And let's face it, the last 100 years of regulating pollution have been pretty hopeless. I mean, look where we are. It's not a good place to be. Okay, so the state changes the prices of all sorts of stuff. You know, there are carbon taxes all over the place. They're just incredibly inefficient. They tax carbon domestically through petrol price and so on, but not imports, for example. So we can have a very sensible frame in which we can adjust some of these prices. And that changes incentives. You know, when you go to the supermarket, you may not think that you're driven by prices, but that's what happens. If I double the price of bread, your consumption will change. So this is how we influence us, because it's our consumption that ultimately causes this outcome. So what does business do? Business tries to make profits. That's what business is there for. It's good at it, right? Or some of it's good at it. And what it does is it looks at the opportunities. Right now, business is positively incentivized to make money out of lots of polluting activities, right? And what we want to do is change that round, and then business will respond. And you know, it's this idea that, you know, oh, it's all business's fault. You know, they're the polluters. If only we can make business behave, it will be fine. Well, business only exists to do stuff for us, you and me. Our consumption is the ultimate pollution source. We cause it. And by changing the structure of our economy, making it efficient, making it work better, making it deliver the things that are not properly priced. For example, mental health, physical health, recreation, clean air, clean water. All of these things come by incentivizing people to do the right thing, rather than, for example, in the Common Agricultural Policy, incentivizing them to do exactly the wrong things. That's why our agricultural land has become a biodiversity desert. That's what happened to the insects. That's what happened to all sorts of things. That won't be enough in itself, but it makes a hell of a lot of difference, and it gets business into the game of doing the right things, because it's incentivized to do the right things, rather than, as I say at the moment, to do many things which are devastating to our environment.
Thank you very much, Dieter. I'd like to turn, if I may, to Jillian Burke, who I'm sure you'll all know from BBC Springwatch and Blue Planet UK. She's, of course, a biologist in her own right, as well as a very distinguished presenter. Jillian, morning. Are you there? Not sure if you're...
I am. Good morning.
Hi. It's very interesting, Jillian, look at it, just taking up Dieter's point about creating an environment in which business is encouraged to behave well. You have as direct a relationship with individuals as perhaps any of us, in the sense that you are, very well-known broadcaster, and you are speaking to them through the power of TV and streaming. And I'm very interested in what you think can be done to, as it were, link up business conduct and individual consumer citizen behavior, because it seems to me that the answer to all of this is a kind of parallel ecosystem in which all of the bits that are acting in the interests of biodiversity have some sort of direction of travel that makes sense. So I'm just kind of keen to filter into the conversation the lessons and wisdom you have from your broadcasting about what we can do as a group of organizations.
Thank you. Well, thanks first of all for inviting me to speak this morning. This is a really different audience that I'm used to, and it's a great opportunity because it gets me thinking in a different way, which I enjoy very much. So what I'd like to do in order to answer your question is there are a few sort of words and statements, I guess, that were made, already, that I was thinking, oh, that's so interesting. So first of all, James kicked off with, saying this is a session where you, the audience, don't need to know as much as you care about, which to a certain extent is true. No one needs to become an expert to care. However, I do think if there's a genuine intention to change business practices, to change whole systems, the way we think is absolutely crucial. So I kind of want to break it down to some real basic stuff and then build it back up again. So we use the word eco a lot, and ecology, economics, and eco, the root word is from ancient Greek, which means oikos, which means our home. And I really like to break it down to that because I feel like it makes it more relatable to most people anyway. And the way I think of ecology and economics is ecology is the way nature runs our home, the planet, and economics is the way we do. And that's, to me, the way I see the distinction. The two are misaligned right now. The sort of twin challenges of the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, of which biodiversity and extinction, mass extinction, are symptoms, the pandemic being another symptom. All of these things are telling us that this whole system, the Earth, the planet that we're living on, is, the biosphere is glitching. Is kind of how it's trying to rebalance. It'll reset itself depending on the makeup of the atmosphere. It will find a balance, but the turbulence that we're experiencing, whether that's climate, weather, pandemics, that turbulence is our planet glitching and trying to reset itself. So to me, that's a really important sort of starting point in order to build up to, well, how are we going to change our behavior? Because if we don't change the way we think, we can't change the way we behave. There's some really big changes as well in the way biologists think about life on Earth. So the traditional view, and probably the one that the image that most people keep in their heads when we talk about the evolutionary tree, is a tree that sort of has a main trunk and branches of life that head out. And the ends of those will never meet again. That is the diversity of life. And the root of that will be sort of 5 kingdoms. There's the plant, animal, fungi, and then the 2 that no one ever remembers, protozoans. And but anyway, I'm getting a bit too involved in that. The point is that life on Earth and true biodiversity isn't a tree where the tips never meet. If you take something like lichen, which is a partnership between a fungus, types of fungus and algae, you're looking at 2 different kingdoms that have joined together to create a life form. So the kind of new view of life on Earth is a tree where the branches, the tips of the branches, the twigs, the leaves join once again to create like a circular, like an impossibly complex 3-dimensional matrix. And that's what life is. That's what biodiversity is. So it's very difficult, therefore, I think, to start to try and break down components and work out, well, we're going to do this and not damage this, or we're going to save this element, but not worry too much about this, because we simply can't, it's impossible to really understand how this whole system works because of its immense complexity. So in terms of what that means in behavior, I think it's one of the things I truly believe, and maybe that's because that's why I'm a science communicator, is that we do actually need to understand and start engaging with the information. And it doesn't necessarily mean becoming an expert, but we live in this amazing age where, this information is available at our fingertips, literally. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be engaging with the information. I mean, right now, 2020 is set to be the hottest year on record. I stayed up really late last night trying to get a sense of all the the climate indicators of where we are right now. 2020, I mean, we've all been talking about COVID, but 2020 is the most frightening year if you're a meteorologist. The Arctic sea ice melted in a way that we've never seen. It's only just refrozen in the last 2 days, beginning in the Laptev Sea, but that's never been recorded in history before. I mean, I could go on and on. There are many, many firsts this year, and the information's there. It's not being reported in the way that I think it should be, but the information is there. And I do really think that in order to get a sense of how urgent this is, it's really important to engage with the information. And that's a starting point for me.
Is that, Gillian, is that a task of the individual citizen or of the media, or both? I mean, because clearly you're not a fatalist by definition. But what you're suggesting is that the task is now, absolutely 11:59 and 50 seconds, and maybe later. And it's no longer a question of sort of leafing idly through the magazine of information. That this needs to be in people's heads right now.
It's I think very much the job of the media, but also of individuals. Depending on capacity, really. I sometimes feel like the burden of responsibility has rested too much. It's a bit unfair on consumers, particularly when there's no transparency or little transparency, how things are produced, how global systems intermesh. But that said, at this stage, I mean, there was a new global heat record this year in Death Valley of 54.4 degrees. Every continent this year in the Northern Hemisphere registered global heat records. It was the hottest year, the hottest summer on record for the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think the concern right now with ecologists and meteorologists is that we have actually hit that tipping point. It's difficult to know exactly when you're in it, but I think it's difficult to not acknowledge that 2020 has been a really critical year in terms of the planet giving us feedback about the imbalance right now. So I think it's about, once you understand the urgency of it, it actually becomes easier to do something. And this is why I find, this is my personal experience and the experience I see of other people, is that initially it feels like knowing this stuff is too scary and too overwhelming. However, and it doesn't take long, the more you know, or the more I know, I should say, the easier it becomes for me to know what to do. It actually becomes easier to start taking action when you have the information. So while it sounds scary, I think we need to be a bit grown up about this and engage with that, because once we know how bad the situation is, it becomes easier to act, because it simply becomes impossible not to act. And that's the way I see it anyway. That's a
very good way of framing it. Thank you very much for that, Gillian. I'd like to move now to Mark Johnston, who's Group Ecologist in the Corporate Environmental team at BP. Morning, Mark.
Good morning.
I mean, we're now at the bone, really, in the sense that we've seen a picture of how carbon pricing, transparency, and so on can make a difference. Let's look at what business can do, and what they're actually going to do. So BP, and I'll leave this to you to give us a synopsis of what they've announced. But in June, BP released a document on biodiversity, setting out a series of objectives and aspirations. And I suppose I'd be very interested to hear your kind of main bullet point version of that, but also, to apply what I would call the Mandy Rice Davis principle is, they would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, what is it about this document that is going to really translate into measurable action that will make a measurable difference?
Great. No, thank you very much. Thank you for raising that. And thank you for these discussions. And it's really good to have these open discussions in this sort of forum. So, I think, first of all, the facts are very clear, that transformative change is needed. Actions on climate change and nature are intrinsically interlinked, and we are, as Gillian's highlighted, we're at that tipping point, we're at that critical point, and businesses and other stakeholders play a very important part of that process. So in terms of what we're doing, and perhaps first of all, just highlight what we've announced in our backtrack in terms of this is more just about, this is not an add-on. We're very much embedding and have been working on biodiversity for a good number of years. So back in February, we launched our new business strategy and ambitions for net zero by 2050 for carbon, and helping the world get there as well. It's not just about BP, it's about helping everybody, the planet and people, get there as well. And then in June this year, we launched our new biodiversity position. It's an update on what we'd been doing previously, taking action to help restore, maintain and enhance nature across our activities. And in that, we've spelled out sort of 3 aims. Aim to achieve a net positive impact on biodiversity in our new projects. And that's not just projects in sensitive areas, it's in all our projects globally, which have a potential to have an impact on biodiversity. Also enhancing biodiversity around our operations, and then supporting biodiversity restoration in the countries where we work. So we've laid out that journey. We don't have all the answers on how we're going to get there, because I think emphasize that, to make the changes, some of the changes we're talking about, needs global action. It needs collective action across governments, NGOs, businesses, civil society, to work and make these things actually happening. So it's not easy. Biodiversity is complex. As Jillian's highlighted, we can't just look at individual species or individual ecosystems. They're all interconnected. So coming back to your point about, this is not just a sudden change. BP's been embedding biodiversity into the way we do things for 15, 20 years or more. From Indonesia in West Papua, we've been working there with local communities and university to helping restore mangrove forests, to work with local communities and helping biodiversity. We have a commitment there of no net loss in biodiversity, working in Angola, West Africa on sea turtle conservation, to cherry points in the US, where we've been creating habitats, and we've been working with local communities. We set up a citizens and science program with local communities there to enhance and support biodiversity. So there's a whole range of things we've been doing over the last 15 or 20 years. But I think we now realize that we now have to take that one step higher. Because we are at this critical time, we need to be doing more. We've been listening to society, to governments, to shareholders, what's expected. The customers, our customers, you and I, expect these things to be happening. We expect us to be taking the sort of actions which we've now starting to implement. Now, of course, it's going to be time. It can take time to develop these approaches, and we have to work with us to do that. And we're going to be working with, we've announced we're going to be working with Fauna and Flora International to help us get there, to actually deliver the action which is needed to deliver on our commitments. And obviously that's going to continue, and we're going to be very transparent about how we progress, and we report on how we're progressing towards this. But it's not easy. We're going to be listening to what people have to say, and learn through this journey. But yeah.
Just as a for instance, Mark, can you give me a very specific example of something that BP does that makes a measurable effect that, as it were, you could present to a worried, a worried member of the Greta Thunberg generation and say, actually, this is for real. This is not just sloganeering.
Sure, no, absolutely. So I'll just take a relatively recent example. So we're working in Sao Tome, just a local example. And there, over the last 3 years now, we've been working with a local conservation group to help sea turtle populations and sea turtle conservation and research. So we've been supporting that activity. They've been doing some fantastic work, and we've actually seen an increase in the sea turtle populations within the country and the breeding populations there. So some of those small actions which we can take in some of the countries we work, we can support those local communities to actually make some of those things actually happen. And there's numerous examples of that, of course, where we actually operate, not just in BP, but in other companies as well, do similar type of initiatives. Now, but it is important to it's not just about biodiversity, it's working with local communities, about education and raising awareness as well. So that's just one sort of quick example.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I'd like to come to Lindsay Evans, if I may, because Lindsay, I think you had an interesting point to make about behavioural economics, if you're there. I don't know if you're... Lindsay, good morning.
Good morning. Hi. I was just thinking back to some of our other talks where we had nudge economics to change consumer behaviour, and that was one of the conversations in the chat. And having studied economics many, many moons ago with everything different, my time, cost benefit analysis was king, but it only works if you get the true costs. So we were also discussing carbon pricing, and I wonder what the panel thought of those things.
Thank you. Dieter.
So thank you. There are several things there. On the behavioural front, yes, of course, it matters what motivates us to do things, and the sorts of wonderful programs that Jillian is involved in do influence the way we think about it. But, you know, part of this is just knowledge. It's about making consumers informed about what they're doing. And what I think is quite a good idea in this frame, and it's more the climate change issue than the biodiversity, though I think they're intimately linked, is something I suggest in my book, which is that you should sit down and write your carbon diary. From when you get up in the morning to when you go to bed at night, try and have a stab at how much carbon's involved in everything you do. You know, from the moment you go to the loo in the morning to what's in the breakfast cereal, and then you can try and work out how much biodiversity risk is involved too. You won't get it right, but just the process of looking at what you're up to, I think is very helpful. Now, on the second point about cost benefit analysis, this is where I depart from many of my economist friends. So the idea in cost benefit analysis is you look at any bit of the environment, there's a discrete bit, and you work out how much people are willing to pay to preserve it, how much they're willing to be paid to accept damage to it, you know, what the marginal value to them is, and you translate that into a cost. And then you try to estimate a sort of ranking of which projects to go for. Well, the environment doesn't come in little marginal bits, it comes in units, ecosystems. And the problem for us individuals is that you can do the right thing at home, you can do the right thing in your daily life, give up flying, things like that you can do. But ecosystems require a collective effort. We have to do this together at scale on systems. And that's why the private sector can do its bit, the market can do its bit, it can react to the pollution prices I've suggested. But in the end, we as societies, and therefore, yes, governments, have to make choices about the protection and enhancement of systems as a whole. We make those decisions about road systems, about electricity systems, about transport systems, but we have to make those about natural systems, natural infrastructure, and that goes way beyond the textbook of cost-benefit analysis. So yes, of course, behaviour matters, information matters, the point that Jillian stressed, and you should try and inform yourself, because we can each do a bit, but we can't do enough individually. This is a collective problem, and therefore we need a collective system infrastructure approach to this. And that's the backbone, like the electricity, gas, water systems, and the backbone of our physical economy. These are the backbones of our natural economy, and that's what you need to do if you want to have sustainable economic growth.
Thank you, Dieter. I want to come back to the other members of the panel, but before we do that, can I turn to Ella Hill to take us through some interesting data visualizations and slides that'll kind of inform us about what we're talking about. Thanks. Over to you, Ella.
Good morning. So to put some of the conversation that we're having today in context, according to the WWF, the world is facing its 6th mass extinction event. And as we've been saying, this loss of biodiversity has been precipitated by human activity. So a comprehensive report that was compiled by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services earlier this year found that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and some of them within decades. So these are some of the headline figures from the report. 40% of amphibian species, 33% of reef-forming corals, and more than a third of all marine mammals are threatened with ecosystem collapse. But it's not just, you know, that million that are at risk. There are millions more species that are in decline. And the WWF's latest Living Planet report found that population levels of animals have fallen by 68% on average since 1970 around the world. And the decline is worst, as you can see, in South America and the Caribbean, where populations of animals have fallen by 94% on average due to things like deforestation, overexploitation like overfishing, and the conversion of habitats for human use. Now, land use change and habitat degradation, so for human use, is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss around the world at present. By the middle of the century, climate change will have a comparable impact on species loss to land use. And earlier this year, I think it was, a paper in the Royal Society journal said that a business as usual warming scenario combined with continued land use change could lead to a loss of 38% of vertebrate species. Now, at present, the industries directly driving a significant amount of biodiversity loss are food production and agriculture. A study of nearly 9,000 threatened or near threatened species of plants and animals found that in 70% of cases, overharvesting is a factor in their decline, and agriculture is a factor in 62% of cases. And this chart shows that to stop the decline in biodiversity requires significant action. So if we continue with our current actions, biodiversity will continue to decline steeply, and that's represented by that blue line down at the bottom. Conservation efforts, represented by that brown line in the middle, will help, but they're not enough to restore species populations, even to around 2010 levels by the end of the century. So what is required is a set of integrated actions, combined measures that combine those increased conservation efforts with a switch to sustainable production and consumption. And every industry can play their part in that sustainability agenda.
Thank you very much, Ella. I'd like to go over to James now. James, are you?
So I just wanted, I'm completely fascinated by this conversation. I just wanted to sort of put a thought to Dieter, Mark, and Jillian, and it starts with this. My brother-in-law has a what used to be a garage in in Wiltshire, where they've got bats. They've got bats in the roof, right? And bats, as we know, are an endangered species, a protected species in this country. At the same time, it's got a record low rating on its insulation. So they've got to take the roof off to try and put in the insulation to do something on the emissions front. But if they do that, they're going to disturb the bats. And the reason I wanted to put this, and Mark, I can see smiling at this, knows where I'm going with this problem, which is, it feels to me as though that West Country insulation job is not so far from some of the choices that we're going to have to make globally. I was in a conversation on Friday with Vicky Holub, who's the chief executive of Occidental, who was saying, Occidental Petroleum, who've taken a different approach to many companies, saying, look, we're going to stick with the oil and gas business, but we're going to try and remove all its associated carbon. And she says that there's currently 40 million tons worth of CO2 sequestration capacity, and it needs to move to 5.6 billion tons. Right? There's a massive industrial project that will remake large parts of our underground reservoirs with CO2. And I suppose the question I'm really interested, I totally buy Jillian's kind of 2020 is a year of urgency. And I'm essentially I don't know what you call your followers, Dieter, whether they're Helmists or Helmites. Anyway, I'm a Helmite in kind of the idea of you have to introduce carbon pricing, you have to introduce outside requirements set by governments in order to make businesses act. What I don't understand is that intersection between delivering on the carbon agenda and delivering on the biodiversity agenda. Because it feels to me as though we're submitting to wishful thinking if we think that they're both going to be hand in hand all the time. And so I'm really interested to know, if you're building an enormous CCS plant, but you're going to disrupt local flora and fauna, who decides who wins in that argument? And I imagine, I don't know, so it's a point really for Dieter, for Jillian, for Mark, for all of them, how we inject external requirements on the biodiversity front that make sure that we still stick to the emissions agenda.
Dieter, I know you have to lead. Thanks so much, James. Do you have time to chip in on that?
Yeah, no, sorry, I have to shoot off a bit before the end, but let me try and answer that question. So the bats example is a brilliant example, and it's also a personal example because I'm grappling with exactly the same problem at the moment. Okay? So what it illustrates is some things which many environmentalists don't want to confront. First of all, there are conflicts that arise between doing the right thing for carbon and doing the right thing for biodiversity. You know, in the passion for planting trees all over the place, I'm told the best thing to do is to cover the countryside in eucalyptus trees if you just want to take up carbon as fast as possible. And obviously that would be an environmental catastrophe for biodiversity and other things. So we want to have woodlands which work both for carbon and biodiversity. So there are trade-offs. And I really fear at the moment we're going down a carbon silo, which is going to do some quite remarkable biodiversity damage. So that's the first thing. There are tensions and trade-offs, and they have to be taken into balance. And if you give a huge value and political priority to carbon and you neglect biodiversity, give it less emphasis and don't give it a proper value, you know what's going to happen. It's a bit like the Forestry Commission covering areas of Scotland in blocks of conifers because the sole objective was timber and nobody thought about the other environmental consequences. But it's also bigger than that. You see, we want to build 300,000 houses a year. People are building HS2. There are all sorts of economic developments taking place which are doing damage to nature. And you can either say, okay, stop. We won't do any damage to nature at all. Basically means no more houses, no more high-speed 2, no more developments of roads, none of that stuff. Well, first of all, that's not going to happen. But secondly, it isn't the right answer. The right answer is the principle, and it's a very demanding principle, called net environmental gain. So if you do damage, and there will be damage, right? There's no question about that. We don't want as much damage as we're going to get, but there will be damage. You have to make a compensating improvement in the environment elsewhere, which is better than the damage you caused. And I don't mean taking a couple of newts out of a pond on a building site and putting them in a pond somewhere else. I mean genuine ecosystem improvements. So if you look at a country like Britain, but you can look anywhere in the world, there's enormous scope to create new landscape nature networks, to join up things, to improve our uplands, which are in terrible biological state, on a really big scale. And these things can be partly paid for by some of the damage which will be done and inevitably is going to be done, and we need to compensate for. So back to the bats and the climate change, my guess is the value of the bats is probably higher than the marginal emissions you're going to save by insulating the roof. So my view is leave the bats alone, turn down the heating, wear a pullover, and try to reduce your carbon consumption where those bats are by changing your lifestyle a bit. But on balance, what we've got is a price for carbon and an obsession with carbon, but no value for bats other than they're a nuisance and they get away in the way of builders. When they're gone forever. So tell him to leave the roof on, do without the insulation, wear a pullover, and look after the bats.
It's a good day for bats, and they've had a pretty raw deal recently in the press. So thank you, Dieter, and thank you very much for contributing. When we come back to Jillian, I'm amazingly, we're sort of not far off the end of the hour, but I wanted to, again, sort of zero in on the specific, if I can. You know, Dieter mentioned a carbon diary, and I'm intrigued about, you know, people who are on the call. Are there 2 or 3 specific things they can do that will actually make a difference? You've talked already about informing themselves and kind of engaged transparency, if you like. But are there other specific things that people can do in concert with business, in their choice of consumption and so on, that can make a difference? I mean, food waste, for example, is something we haven't even got around to.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, yes. There's plenty we could do, and there's plenty we should be doing. I hinted earlier that I do feel that the burden of responsibility on consumers is unfair because, you know, I'm, you know, fully paid up, sort of environmental, trying to live a green life. I find it really hard. You know, I go to, like, if I have to, like I already feel guilty going to the supermarket, but I'll go to the supermarket. I want to buy organic produce, but it's wrapped in plastic. So do I go for the non-organic, loose produce that's not in plastic, or do I buy the stuff in plastic because it's farmed organically? You know, I mean, the whole thing is just a complete nightmare, you know, in terms of like a consumer experience. So my point is that, you know, there's so much we can do, but I think there genuinely is only so much we can do as consumers dealing with the current options available. I think what we need is like better options in the first place. And there's lots of recommendations from, gosh, all kinds of organizations, you know, which will hint at how this could be done. Circular economy is one. Ecological transparency, having more information about how products are made. I think there was, I think it was a book by Daniel Goleman called Ecological Intelligence, or I'll have to look that up and put it in the chat. But there was a study done in like Walmart in the States, and they found that actually when they gave people the information about where and how two products, like for like products, are made, the bottom, like money wasn't the deciding factor. When they understood that a product had impacts in terms of where it was made, how it was made, on communities, on the environment, people were actually happy to pay a little bit more for a product that had less impact. So I think it's a mistake to think that consumer choices are mostly driven by buying the cheapest product. In the absence of any other information, that is true. But if we have more transparency about how products are made, where they come from, and at what cost, both to society, to communities, and to the, you know, to the environment, people will make better choices. So there's lots of things that could be done, but I think in the present system, there's simply not very good options in the first place. So you know, so I feel it's a bit unfair to be constantly looking at consumers going, you need to make better choices, particularly when, frankly, most people don't have that capacity. And then we're faced with the bats, you know, and you know, what do you do? And to me, there's another story, and this is one of those things I've always been a bit afraid to say, because I normally talk to people in the RSPB and real kind of hardcore birders, but I find, you know, putting out bird feed is a really interesting conundrum. Because mostly people say, I can't afford to buy organic food. Yet the amount of money that is spent, millions of pounds every year on bird feeders, the seed, the whole thing, makes me wonder if each household that does spend a lot of money on bird feeders might just use that money to buy organic food. Because to me, putting out bird feeders when there's, you know, no habitat, and what habitat is available has such heavy pesticide loads that there isn't any food for the birds in the first place, is kind of crazy. So I feel like there's loads and loads of these, you know, this cognitive dissonance. You're trying to do the right thing, but you keep coming up against these problems. And I think ultimately it's looking at kind of completely changing the system, you know, to circular economy, to having more transparency about how things are produced, so that we have better, better options in the first place than what currently available.
That's really fascinating. I can't remember which psychologist it was that said that when you get to cognitive dissonance, you're on the verge of making a breakthrough. So perhaps there's some optimism in that. Could we go to Catherine Simons, who I think has some interesting points about it's been talking in the chat about the connection between the consumer and the corporate. Catherine, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Sorry, it's always a bit weird to just be pulled in like that. On the connection between the corporate and the consumer.
Yes, that was.
So I mean, personally, I try quite hard, and I think I've managed to get through some of the conundrums the previous lady Jillian, suggested. I mean, certainly on the subject of organic foods, I don't think they're necessarily the best for the environment. I'm in a veg box scheme, and I think that's quite a good way of doing it. Also quite fun and interesting. You learn how to cook celeriac or something weird you have never used. But I think there is an intertwining between the two, because I think we're not, as individuals, we are not just consumers. This is not our only power. We also work for organisations. We are part of businesses. I think you can't separate the two. And I think there's a real cop-out in parts of the environmental movement now to say that the individual doesn't matter. But actually the individual, oh God, I'm going to sound like a frigging Thatcherite. The individual is in the end all we have, working collectively with others. And so we as individuals have to work collectively. We have to try and do whatever we can at both the personal, the political, and if you like, the sort of economic, the business, commercial level in our own professions. And I think it's sort of a bit like the separation of the environment and the economy, that they're not separate, and we're all part of it, and we all need to do what we can at every level in our lives, because it is that existentially important. It's not just carbon either, of course, it's the wider environmental concern. So that would be.
Thank you very much. Tragically, we've hit the hour, and I know everyone has things they have to go off to. So with great regret, I'm going to have to call an end to the call. But before I do that, so thank you all. Thank Mark, Dieter, and Jillian for being such fantastic experts and enlightening us on a thing I think we took for hours about, and also Jenny for providing some illustrative therapy during our discussion. I mean, I think there are so many points one can take away from this, and things that can inform Tortoise journalism. But you know, Dieter's point about carbon pricing clearly is one that is at the heart of all this, and yet still it has not been resolved. Jillian's, I think, arguments about the need for radical transparency, but the corollary of that also has to be citizen engagement. And Mark's point about, you know, the test, I mean, walking the walk, and making it clear to the world that these measures by companies like BP are real, and of course that is for companies themselves to demonstrate to us all. And I'm left with, you know, a kind of early proto shopping list of practical actions we can take. This idea of a carbon diary, the memorable notion of the BAT trade-off, which I think is will be one of my favorite political concepts of 2020, and the concept of net environmental gain. And also I love the bird feed conundrum, which I think does capture that cognitive dissonance. But as I say, I think cognitive dissonance often precedes breakthrough. So it's been a fantastically enlightening hour, and thank you all very much for taking part. It's a pleasure to partner with BP, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. I wish we could go on longer, but I hope you have a lovely day, and thank you all very much for taking part, and see you soon. Bye for now.